Bulletin, and I want to welcome you to the third panel in SVP series on poverty and wealth inequality. I'm the Executive Director of Social Venture Partners, and SVP Seattle brings together people and organizations to create more just and equitable communities by collectively sharing our time, talent, treasure, and ties. We also engage in deep learning together about how we want to do this, which is how we came to this Poverty and Wealth Inequality series, which is really designed to give us the foundations of what that means, how people are using that in their own philanthropic practices, and then what are larger policy solutions to that. So if you were here for I know some of you were here for the first session with Anne E. Price, who really gave us it was called The Foundations of Wealth Inequality. And really, for me, my takeaway was the difference between wealth and income, and really the government blocks and barriers that have created those differences, and really the vast wealth inequality we have in this country. The second session, we had 4 people, including Kathy and Dave, speak about how they're using their philanthropic practices to address, and their wealth to address inequities and create more just solutions. And one of the takeaways I had from that was Beth McCaw, who talked about the curb cut effect, and just when you design it, she was talking about how in the Bay Area, when a lot of disability rights activists were planning and advocating for curb cuts, one of the things that they learned was actually everybody benefits. Like everybody benefits when you design, when you are thinking about designing for everyone, everyone benefits. And then tonight we're here because we've been taking on a journey. So from, what is the problem? How are individuals really addressing this to what are the policy solutions? And we are so lucky to be joined by 4 leaders who work on this every day. We have Dr. Stefan Blanford, who is the Executive Director of Children's Alliance, which is a former SVP grantee. We have Lilian Ballesteros, who is the Executive Director of the Latino Community Fund. We have Senator Noel Frank, who's been a champion on these solutions, and Sharon Navas, who is the Executive Director of Equity in Education and also a former SVP. Equity in Education is also a former SVP grantee. So you can see kind of the through line there. So we're going to hear from all of them. I'm going to ask them to all introduce themselves, and that this is really meant to be an open discussion about what's going on. We are having this now at kind of mid-November because I'm sure they are all really busy with their eye to January, which is the Washington State, where we'll kick off the Washington legislative session. So the great news is, as you're listening to this tonight, think about how you might want to act or be inspired in the new year as you're planning your resolutions. So with that, I'm going to start with Stefan.
Well, thank you. I'll start off and apologize. My voice is not very strong. I got a diagnosis this week of asthma, which I had as a child, and just recently it's come to revisit me. So if I get a little verklempt, thank you. So I was excited to have the opportunity to present. I was a Brainerd Fellow at SVP, so I have a deep connection to SVP. I think I was in the first Brainerd Fellowship and ended up staying in long enough to become the chair of the Advocacy and Policy Committee for a while. And so have deep affection for many of the friends that I have gotten to know at SVP. And really am excited about the opportunity to talk a little bit about our legislative agenda. As the Executive Director of Children's Alliance, I lead an organization that's 40 years old that is advocating fiercely around for all 1.6 million kids in Washington State, with a particular focus on those that are furthest behind: Black and brown kids, low-income kids, kids of color throughout the state. And we work primarily in the areas of early learning, in health policy, and then around progressive revenue. And I can spend more time talking about that later. I'm not contagious, by the way.
Thank you for appreciate it. Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I guess I'll start the first pattern that I was also a Rainier Fellow. I think it was back in 2018, I want to say. Time is a little fuzzy before and after 2020 and during. And so, yeah, exciting. It was great to be in the space and then to come back today and to see all the work that SVP's been doing. So a little bit about Latino Community Fund. So we are a statewide organization. We're primarily King County and Yakima County, but we do a lot of partnership work and leadership development across the state. And we're a 16-year-old organization. We had our quinceañera a year or two ago, I think it was. We went all out. And but for us, I think where we're coming to this work has really been, our work has really been centered on investing in our Latin communities across the state, and really access to resources and really equitable resource distribution across the state and in our communities and for our communities. We do a lot with our leadership development, working with youth who are really leading on a lot of what they want to see change policy in the state of Washington. And we do a lot of advocacy work. And I think what we have seen so much, just as an overview, we're kind of touching on all these pieces, and for us it's really important to have that through line, because we are working with our families on rental assistance and access to food vouchers, but it is not enough, right? It is just not enough, and it is not a replacement for really changing the structure of what is available to families who are really struggling. And so for us, it's been really important to look toward legislation, to look toward policy change as a way to really build off of the power of our communities, but look at what does real resource distribution look like if our families get what they need. If we're not having to pay somebody's rental assistance for 2 months, and then what happens after that 2 months. So for us, it's been really important to have that through line, in particular in Yakima County, making sure that we're looking across the state where families were really impacted. For us, during COVID, we did a lot of rapid response work. And so now for us, it's been looking at the policy around not wanting to do that rapid response work with such urgency, but really thinking about how do we actually change structure. So just kind of a little bit.
Well, thank you. I feel like I need to start to say I was not a Brainerd Fellow. But Mr. Brainerd did invest in my earliest campaigns when I ran for office back in 2012, so there's a connection there. So good evening, everyone. Noelle Frame, State Senator from the 36th Legislative District, which is the northwest corner of the city of Seattle. I am wrapping up my 8th year in the legislature, which is like, how did that happen? Time flies. But only my first year in the state Senate. I was in the House for 7 years. I currently serve as the Vice Chair of the Housing Committee and the Vice Chair of the Business, Financial Services, Gaming, and Trade Committee, which I'll tell you in a minute why that seems particularly relevant. When I left my last term in the House, I was the Chair of the Finance Committee that handled all tax revenue. I was on the Appropriations Committee and on the committee that addressed economic development. I have been doing organizing work related to our tax code for more than a dozen years. Before I became a legislator, the last full-time job I had is I was a director of a nonprofit called Progressive Majority, where I did candidate recruitment and training and support. And one of the things that I trained them on was how the tax code was upside down and regressive in partnership with the Washington State Budget and Policy Center and others. It's been really fun to then serve with these folks that I helped to recruit and train over the last many years. But I also stand before you as a kid of 2 restaurant workers and somebody who grew up fairly low income in rural Clark County, somebody who grew up in a school district that was deeply underfunded, in part because the state was not meeting its funding obligation to basic education. And my community was one that did not pass property tax levies, and they were a supermajority at that time. And so I learned literally as a 17-year-old that my community just didn't care about my education. So that's my origin story and what got me into politics. And here I am, 43 years old, representing, the part of Seattle, still fighting to fix the tax code. But I also stand before you somebody who's benefited from wealth building strategies. I was really lucky, and I mean lucky, to be able to buy my home in Seattle 10 years ago with down payment assistance from the state of Washington. And I focus a lot on home ownership as I have had these conversations about the wealth tax, which we'll talk about quite a bit. The through line with wealth building and home ownership is huge. And I think the other major pathway for wealth building in addition to home ownership is owning and growing your own small business. And what did I do after buying my home and building equity in my home? I got a home equity line of credit, and I used that to help buy into a business last year and became an owner of the business that I've been an employee at for 6 years. And like, that's the opportunity, like I'm a living example of what state policy investments can mean for somebody who otherwise never would have had those opportunities. And so, as you might imagine, I then turn around and fight for everybody else to get those same opportunities. Particularly our communities who have quite literally been prevented from building wealth through state-sanctioned discrimination. And I would love to talk about the Covenant Home Ownership Act a little bit today, which is a major victory this last session to undo and address some of that harm and provide wealth building opportunities, particularly for our Black Washingtonians and other BIPOC communities who were discriminated against through state law. So look forward to the conversation.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sharon Navas. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Equity in Education Coalition. I am also not a Brainerd Fellow, so I am evidently an amazing company. We started the organization. So we started the organization because of a lawsuit called McCleary v. Washington State. Heard chuckle. Where the Washington Supreme Court basically said the state is not fully funding education and that property tax is illegal as a source of funding education. I thought we were gonna be a coalition for about 3 or 4 months and we were gonna fix it. I also had just moved to Seattle and didn't know that we had a state capital. So and now I'm here sitting next to Senator Frank, so life has an amazing way of throwing weird balls at you. So I thought I was gonna be there for about 3 months, it was gonna be great, and then somebody sat me down, Andy Nichols from the Budget and Policy Center sat me down and said, hey, do you know anything about the state taxing system and what that means? And I unfortunately said no, and about 72 hours later, my eyes glazed over and I was like, I don't know what has happened to my life, but evidently we're upside down and we need to fix it. And I don't pay income tax? And he's like, right. I'm like, cool. I'm still not sure. He's like, don't worry about it, I'll let you know. So that's how we started the EEC and the idea of tax, of a progressive tax system, looking at wealth tax and how to fund education. Because for us, we keep selling the dream of education being the pathway out of poverty, and we don't fund education. So what we're doing is that we're telling kids that their education is worth it, and then telling them that they're not worth it by not funding. So for us, it's really important to bring those two things together. As we start talking about progressive ideas like guaranteed basic income and the big bonds, we're really looking at the bigger picture, which is if we invest in our communities and end poverty now, we don't have to put money into things like the safety net and corrections later.
Thanks so much. Oh, and you can hold on to that. I've got my own special mic. So I'm gonna start off and ask some questions, but really I know that we want, and the speakers want this to be a dialogue. I have one ask. We've got, we're having this video because there are people who can't be here tonight that want to hear it. If you want to speak, please wait for me to bring you the mic, because otherwise the video won't pick it up. So y'all just kind of run around the video. Last time I think probably darting back and forth. So that's just the ask. But the first question is really to any of you to start to answer is, a term I heard you all mention was this idea of upside down. What is that, you know, we're on a learning journey, like, what is that? I know that we don't have an income tax, but what is that mean? And it looks like that you've been nominated, Senator.
I know. Who gets to do it? Thank you for that question. So Washington State has the worst tax code in the nation. And when we say the worst, we mean it is the most upside down, it is the most regressive, and if none of those terms mean anything to you, the actual numbers are, we make those with the least pay the most, and those with the most pay the least. And we talk about this data point that I'm about to share with you, which is a measure of income. So to the earlier point, it's not even a measure of wealth. So we asked the lowest income households making like $24,000 or less to pay 18% of their income in taxes. And our highest income households, which in this metric starts at like $250,000 of income, to pay 3% or less. It's like 6 or 7x, right? And when you talk about wealth, just think about that. If our highest bracket is households that make $250K a year, y'all, like my husband works in tech, like that's a lot of people that make that much money now, okay? But if you talk about wealth, our wealthiest households in the state are paying a teeny, tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of their overall wealth in taxes. And that's what we're talking about. It's like, how can we, the state of Washington, with all of our progressive values, have this blemish on our record that is the tax code? And so we've all been working, trying to address it through different strategies, both by asking those with the most to pay more and asking those with the least to pay less. We really need to do it on both sides of the scale. And our passage of the capital gains tax in 2021, at the same time we passed the working families tax credit, is a perfect example of pairing two different reforms in the tax code, both of those on excise taxes, to try to get at that, but we have so much more work to do. So that's a quick explanation.
That's great. And again, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, but my next question is really, again, to all of you, is the SVP, like what we've been known for traditionally is doing collective granting, and I know a lot of us practice that financial part of giving. Like, why is it so, like, I think we asked the question, like, why is it so important for us to care about the tax code, or philanthropy to care about all this? And I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this. Like, why should we care about this? Because we're out there, SVP partners, they're sharing their time, they're sharing their talent, their treasure, and their ties, their networks.
I will just start, and I want to use an example to really illustrate a point, because when it happened, it was particularly frustrating for us in the legislature. We had a moment where, and again, it's like there's a role for philanthropy, but it's like we have to understand where it fits in the scale of overall work. And we have this massive housing crisis. Okay, so we now have the numbers that we need to build 1.1 million homes over the next 10 years. We've done the analysis that half of those homes need to be subsidized to be affordable. And we have folks living unsheltered all over our beautiful state, and homelessness is a housing problem. Period, end stop. We do not have enough homes. Cost of living has skyrocketed. You may have just read the Seattle Times story where a woman making $70,000 is living out of her car with 2 children. Like, that is the state of affairs. And we had a particularly frustrating moment a couple of years ago where we were trying to coordinate. I'm going to just leave the specifics out so as not to really offend, but we were trying to meet with a local agency about the literal $1 billion that we were working to advocate for housing investments. And they canceled a meeting with us to go do a press conference with major donors and philanthropists that were across Microsoft, the Gates Foundation, Amazon, and one other donor. Between them, put in $20 million to fund, to focus on downtown unsheltered homelessness. $20 million is a joke compared to the billions of dollars we need to invest to solve the housing crisis. And it was such a telling moment for us. It was so frustrating to watch local government partners run to a press conference with major donors to look. And here we are 2 years later, and that program has been shut down. Just got shut down a few weeks ago. Have we solved unsheltered homelessness in downtown Seattle? No. So that's it. I mean, it's just a really small point to illustrate that like we often run towards and celebrate philanthropy and pat ourselves on the back. And it's important to try innovative ideas and all that, but it doesn't replace, right? I'm glad that folks were willing to put in money to try an innovative idea. And it didn't solve the problem. And it was shut down. And meanwhile, like, are we giving, patting legislators on the back for, investing $1 billion in housing? No, because it's hard for people to see progress. It's so that's just a small point, but I think it quite beautifully illustrates why it's a both and philanthropy can't replace sort of basic funding of basic community needs and foundational supports.
We were very fortunate at Children's Alliance to have Professor Dorothy Brown come and speak to us in the spring, early summer. This year, she's the author of the book, The Whiteness of Wealth. And she was talking about the role of tax policy at the federal level, but I think you could extrapolate that and say at the state level as well, in creating wealth, particularly for communities of color and communities that have been disadvantaged by tax policy. And she's a professor at Brown University. She has all the statistics that show that that upside down tax policy has severe implications on low-income families, Black and brown families. For me, it was so enlightening because I had a few board members and other members of our stakeholder group that weren't excited about the idea of a professor of taxation coming and being your keynote speaker at an event. But no one walked out of that room uninspired because she broke it down in such a way that you realize that tax policy makes a huge difference, not only on income, but on wealth creation. And wealth creation is the coin of the realm. If we really want to change outcomes for kids and families that have been disadvantaged over time, we have to start talking about how can we create wealth so that they are not subject to a job change or a car breaking down or so many other variables that affect communities all the time. And so I think there's a role for philanthropy to play in helping to illuminate those ideas. I'm the board chair of another organization that talks about how important it is to have the right advocates to speak to an issue. And frequently, Black and brown leaders can't be those people, right? And so we have this concept inside of our organization where we say from white lips to white ears. Sometimes it is a person of goodwill who is in a position where they have benefited and they recognize the privilege that they have and they're willing to speak that truth. That in some ways it makes them a class traitor and they get accused of that sometimes, but more likely they are able to open eyes and open hearts and help people to realize the systemic issues that are baked here. So frequently we have these narratives that people are undeserving because they don't work hard enough. And what we're really trying to get at is there structural issues baked into our institutions, our policies and procedures that are the real barriers that are preventing people from being able to make progress.
What's coming to mind is this piece around like these short-term fixes, and our community so much see and are already speaking to that is not working, which is why bringing together leaders from community, we talk about this service and getting somebody, a social service, and yet it is such a short-term fix when we don't fix a whole policy. And what comes to mind even is this philanthropy piece of somebody had donated turkeys and we were giving turkeys away. And I was in contact with a family and trying to get this woman her turkey, And I had to wait 2 hours because she couldn't get off of work, she couldn't get childcare, she couldn't even get the turkey. And this idea that philanthropy, that the turkey is such a great thing, when all of those structural pieces, this person couldn't even get that. They couldn't even reach that. And so when we talk about really generating wealth, really thinking about what is it that's actually stopping our families from being able to live real full lives, that this turkey is not gonna fix it if you can't even get the damn turkey. So, I think for us, that piece is what we're seeing so much in our community brings up. And I'd have to say, and he's here in the room, Kamau, the executive director of Washington Community Alliance, that I get to serve on the board of, that is doing incredible work also on looking at the analysis of the increased poverty in our communities. And that the Washington Community Alliance came out of the census work, really about representation of our communities, of our BIPOC communities, our rural communities, our communities across the state, our immigrant communities. And that work over the last few years has been community-led. Those organizations, those leaders, those family members who are looking and saying the representation isn't just enough, the services are not enough, and why Washington Community Alliance is now with a coalition of leaders from across the state doing that work on tax policy, doing that work about baby bonds, looking at what would it really look like to have wealth generation for low-income families. And also not just that these policies change, but that people have access to them. And we work a lot with our immigrant communities, our undocumented communities, our workers who are not accessing these things when they come from, the grant is great and the grant runs out. And without that guarantee of having access, that's really where we're seeing a lot of families struggle. And so it's been really important, I'd say, I think for this piece to really go beyond the turkey, go beyond the social service, and really look at what are all the other structural barriers. And so there's great, I'm gonna probably say his name a couple other times tonight. Really, it's been great to see that research coming out of community who already is feeling it, but putting numbers to it, really.
No,
Oh, I have my own special mics. I forgot.
Together.
What? I know. So I love all this, and one of the questions I know that people were really itching for in our very first session when we learned about foundations of wealth inequality is, like, so what do we do about it? And so we've been waiting for over a month to hear, like, what can we do about it? And I know that all of you are actually working on that. So specifically, what is some legislation or some bills that you can share that are coming up and that we might see it in January? And I know some have been introduced before, but what are these solutions as we talk about, like, tax code, or we talk about baby bonds, or all of this? What are they? What do they mean? And what will change as a result?
I will tell you from the non-legislative side what you can do about it. Fund the organizations that are doing the work. Fund the organizations. Do not ask them for $10,000 worth of reporting for a $5,000 check. Don't ask them to not have any overhead or administrative fees, because a lot of our organizations that do this work are all administrative and overhead organizations. I run policy organization. 95% of the money that goes into my organization is considered overhead. I pay staff, I pay rent, I pay office, I pay mileage. I pay for someone to come in and talk to my staff about how they can manage their money to actually build wealth. I don't pay anybody on my staff less than $85,000 a year. Pay organizations what they're worth. Not what society thinks we're worth, because society doesn't think we're worth anything. I am a business with a tax code. The 501c3 is a tax code. It's nothing less and nothing more than what Amazon does, than what Microsoft does. What I sell is hope that tomorrow go down to Olympia, go down with us. One of the things that Stefan just said was that you will have a specific privilege and power that you don't use often enough, which is talk to your friends, talk to other people that look like you, talk to other people that are in the same circles as you, because the things that you know, the things that you're learning here at SVP, not everybody has the privilege, and this is a gift. Tell them. So when COVID started, my organization, which is a public policy organization, pivoted 100% to doing rapid response. The only reason that we did not close was because we got a generous gift from Kathy and David Habib, who are here, and SVP and a few other funders, including Facebook, and they just said, do what you need to do to survive. Then, remember at the beginning of COVID, we thought it was gonna be a month? We got money from Kathy and David, we got money from Facebook, we got money from a bunch of other friends, and it was coming in March and April, and they're like, if you survive until May, great. We don't need a report, we don't need anything, and that was saving us. Because I got to keep my whole entire team on staff, 100%. So then what we did was that we actually looked down the river where babies were drowning, and we were just like, okay, what is this upriver situation that we're looking at? And everyone was just like, well, we can't get our kids on Zoom because they don't have a laptop. And a lot of our families don't have internet. So if you don't know, 267,000 people in Washington State in April of 2020 didn't have access to the internet. 267,000 students didn't have access to the internet. We only have 1.3 million kids in school. So a quarter of our kids didn't have access to the internet. And we're not talking about rural Washington, I'm talking about Southeast Seattle, I'm talking about Madrona, I'm talking about Kent. Tukwila lost 341 laptops that we delivered. Lost. Like they got them, but like don't know. That's exactly what the superintendent told me. He was just like, I got them. I was like, cool. And then I found out that they were pawned, which is fine, because families had to pay what they had to pay to do the thing, right? But we were out there giving, I have a funny story. We got 15,000 gallons of hand sanitizer delivered to my house, and I didn't tell my husband. And for some reason, he thought I was getting shoes delivered. I was like, I know I'm a shoe addict, but that's a new level at the beginning of COVID. Well, the reason that I say all that is because as we were able to survive this, we were given money to survive it without any of the strings attached that is normally part of the philanthropy world, which is if we give you 5,000, we're going to need 72 pages of a report, and we're going to need all the metrics and the this and the that, and what's your data point, and sometimes we don't have those. Because while I can tell you how many vaccines we distributed the summer of 2020, the fall of 2020, I cannot tell you the stories behind those vaccines, except that I had to pick up an elder from Bothell because the only vaccine that she was able to get was down near Century Line. And she was going to take a 3-hour bus if I didn't go pick her up. So please fund organizations, especially organizations that are led by, staffed by, and governed by. But then go to Olympia with us. Literally, do not be afraid to call us and be like, hey, Executive Director of Balance Our Tax Code, I have nothing to do on a Tuesday afternoon. Like, what are the laws that are happening? What are the bills? You know, Senator Frame has an amazing legislative assistant who lets everybody know what's happening, what's on her committee, follow it, and go down there and talk to her and talk to the other committee members who are waffling on some of the progressive things that we actually need to pass in Washington State. Because there are too many people that don't think that we deserve support.
By the way, that's an announcement for our next session. If you don't know how to engage when the legislature is in session, that's our next session. So thank you.
I'll jump in. I feel like I could go 1,000 directions with this question. So I'll hit some highlights, and then I would encourage folks to ask me questions so I have an excuse to tell you more. So here we go. I feel like the question was what are the things to expect in the next session? And then the 24 session specifically, I feel like and it's sort of taking a big step back. Housing is perhaps one of the biggest costs for our families, particularly in this region. Followed really closely by childcare, says the mom of a 3-year-old in preschool. Don't get me started about that one. But housing is it's a major cost. In addition to it being, you know, housing is a human right, we want housing to make sure that our unsheltered neighbors are coming inside. It's also just a major pocketbook economic issue and the ability for people to afford to live here. And we did incredible work this last session tackling the zoning piece and the supply piece of housing, which was very overdue. We had can only be described as exclusionary housing. We undid that. We've now made it possible to build middle form housing in any place that we could have built single homes before. And we hope that our municipalities across the state will take us up on that and actually start to do this. It's gonna take a solid decade to catch up. That was an important first step. Quite frankly, we did very little on like direct affordability from a subsidizing standpoint, right? So we addressed the supply piece, which we hope over the next decade will bring costs down because supply will increase. But we need to talk about more of that subsidy. As I mentioned earlier, half of these homes need to be subsidized to be affordable. We made the biggest investments in homeownership in state history last year. I know the decision package has gone in from Commerce, and I hope the governor will oblige to like double that this year, because I think we're all understanding that the more we can do on homeownership from the state perspective, the better. So that's sort of one piece. I will just say there's also just like implementation, and a lot of times we focus on like what's the new thing we can pass. We also need to implement the stuff we've passed well. And we just passed the Covenant Homeownership Act. That will take some time, but this is a special purpose credit program. Again, that's what I was talking about earlier, that is targeted to individuals and their descendants who were Washington residents and were discriminated against through housing exclusions, through those documents that said, you can't live here, you can't buy this home. There's implementation to do to like ensure that that is done properly, so families are accessing that. We also have the Community Reinvestment Act, which is $200 million we put in the budget last year as well, and that is intended to support communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And those funds can be used for homeownership, education, starting a business, again, all sort of wealth building strategies. So those are things that are sort of, I think, what's most likely to be paid attention to in 24, maybe more investment in homeownership and implementing these things that we have just done. And part of that is 60 days is a short session, y'all. It is, I can barely breathe during short sessions. Like the minute we get one deadline, like the next one's upon us. And so I think for much of what we're talking about in this like list, I don't know if they've gotten this yet, but like a lot of this is gonna continue to be educating, socializing, bringing people along. And I will just say, this is, to Sharon's point, like this is where you all really can play a role. During our multi-year effort, decade-long effort to pass the capital gains tax, it was very helpful to have folks who would themselves pay the capital gains tax show up and say, I want to pay this, I'm willing to do this. With my wealth tax proposal, it's been a little bit harder because we are really trying to tackle extreme wealth. And, I'll just preview, when I introduced the bill in 2021, and I'll say this and then I'll actually explain what the policy is for folks that are not informed. We started at $1 billion, what is essentially a threshold, $1 billion threshold. 2 years later, it came back and said, we're gonna do $250 million. I think if I brought it back in 25, I'd probably do it at 50 million. I've talked to the Department of Revenue, and it's kind of diminishing returns once you get below 50 million. And I'm thinking maybe we will have people that have $50 million, and we start to get into the same realm of advocates within this community that supported us on capital gains tax that might show up and be able to say, yeah, I'm one of those people, and lead that fight, because it did help. And I would say, I think Washington State is uniquely positioned to be a leader in this space. We are big, bold economic leaders in Washington State. What we do here matters. People watch us. the minimum wage is perhaps the most beautiful illustration of that, right? $15 minimum wage is mainstream now. It is popular, it's happening by ballot measure all across this country. That started in SeaTac, Washington, and then Seattle, right? But I think we also there's a lot of other things that we do here that are models for the nation. So, for folks that are not familiar with the wealth tax proposal, I use the wealth tax because it's something that's broadly understood, and I was trying to very intentionally connect it to national efforts. I think the more work I do on this, I'm like, the more I have to explain it. The wealth tax proposal is a property tax. It's a narrowly tailored property tax on a class of assets that is just wholly exempted from the tax code today. So when Stefan was talking about Dr. Brown's book, The Whiteness of Wealth, what she talks about is we make choices in our tax code that advantage some parts of our community and disadvantage some parts of our community. And so when I explain my proposal, it's very simple. All I'm asking is that the wealthiest people in our state, including literally some of the wealthiest people in the world, pay taxes on their assets just like the rest of us are already paying taxes on ours. We pay 1% plus asterisk. We pay 1% on the privilege of ownership of our asset, which tends to be real estate, our homes. Our businesses pay tax on their personal or tangible property of their businesses. And we just don't tax financial assets? Why? I don't understand. But it's actually not hard when you actually understand the history. Washington State has a history of doing a lot of things, and one of them is fighting to not pay taxes. When I read Dorothy Brown's book on the whiteness of wealth, she talks about the Seaborn family, and we have married filing jointly because of the Seaborn family of Washington State, Seattle specifically. Today, literally today, we have a case pending in front of the U.S. Supreme Court brought by another Washington State family of Redmond, the Moore family, who, if they are successful, may undo the entire federal personal and corporate income tax code by challenging a 2017 repatriation tax, trying to get at foreign investment and ownership. But it could literally undo the corporate income tax that I pay as a small business owner. As an owner of a pass-through entity, I pay tax on the profits of my company, even though I have not necessarily realized those profits. I pay tax on that. If the Moore case is successful, depending on how the court interprets it, they can just upend that. Washington State family. So I think those of you who are in this room, and to Jerome's point, the folks that you call friends and work with and run in circles with, I think we are uniquely poised to be a very different story about taxation here from Washington State. Start by fixing our own tax code. Help me talk to folks in other states, which I'm already doing, by the way. I'm coordinating with 10 other states across the country. And let's fix it, shall we? So, I could go into more, but I'll stop there.
I'd just say really quickly, so the capital gains discussion a few years ago, I was privileged to testify a few times. And you usually find out that you're going to testify, and you sign on, and you have no idea if you're going to testify in the first 15 minutes or if you're going to testify 4 hours later. And so you get a chance to hear the people that testify before you get a chance to come up. I usually put on some tea and pull out some other work and start working away, but I'm listening all the time. And as a former school board director, 10 years ago, I was on the ballot in Seattle and served on the school board here in Seattle. And so I'm really paying attention to what arguments resonate and how do legislators show with their faces that that person makes sense. I'm going to change my vote because of what that person said. And what I saw time and time again was people that we had educated, that were interested in the work, that we had educated, that they had practiced their arguments, and they had the opportunity to provide testimony. They could be powerfully persuasive with legislators. And those in particular that stood to pay the tax were the ones that were the most compelling. We had, lines of people that were all practiced and ready to go. But in some cases, the ones who said, I will pay this tax. I'm eligible to pay the tax, and I'm happy to pay it. Those were the ones that were really compelling. And to the extent that you are in that class of people, you have a disproportionate advantage, disproportionate influence on the direction that this legislation will take. And so I encourage you to consider that.
I'll share also, to that point, kind of reinforcement of, I think it was 2017, and we were trying to get a few meetings with legislators, and we kept asking, and we kept asking, and we kept emailing, and we kept asking. And then there was a delegation of philanthropy foundations that made the call, and they got a meeting. And so it very much manifests itself, and to the point of having somebody in the room who can say, I am the person that is going to do this, that very much legislators are listening. And so, it sounds like there's a great upcoming opportunity to learn more on how to get down to Olympia, make that meeting. We've got people who get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, come from other parts of the state, because they want to be there and say what they need. And so to do that, to show up to somebody's lobby day, see what other lobby days are happening, I think it is a very welcoming. If you haven't been and you need to get trained, no worries. But telling that story, and for legislators to hear that, that door will open. That door will open for some people, and it won't open as quickly or at all for others. And so helping to push that door open is great action, I'd say.
I love that. If you don't have an this might seem like a tangent, but it's not. If you don't already have an SVP Seattle sweatshirt, we have them in the back. And we used to say, so it's a plug, and Letty really is tired of having them in her trunk, so please take one. But it used to say we do time, talent, and treasure. And something we added last year was ties. And what that means to me is that we open up our networks and we build relationships. And I think, Lillian, your story, it's true. Like, it is true. And there are many, we have models and leaders like Noelle Frame who are going to meet with people. But we have, as someone that used to work for an elected official, there are many that won't take those calls unless they're donors, they're powerful constituents. So I think that's just speaking to another way that we are showing up now at SVP Seattle. I wanted to start to open it up to questions. If anybody has a question, raise your hand, and I'm going to bring you the mic.
And don't forget to take the battery with you when you get our battery.
Oh, right, my battery. Oh, absolutely. Different.
Okay, so I am very excited by the opportunity to learn how and to be that pair of white lips as necessary or helpful. So I'm assuming that I could just go talk to you or go talk to you and you could sign me up. Is that a? But I'm wondering if there is a better, maybe a more dynamic list that SVP could help sort of manifest, that becomes like a sort of a live call to action. If you've been trained about law, policy, this is happening in Olympia, show up, sign up, it might make us a bit more efficient that way, or effective.
Yeah, come to the next session.
But not just how to talk, but also just how we sort of activate as a group.
Yeah, we'll be part of it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Cool. And then my next question, it sort of stems from what you just said, which was a part of the conversation I was having earlier today, which was, on the one hand, there's the sort of the evil of money in politics. But to the extent that one is a donor, you know, that can be leveraged to, you're saying open doors. You know, so to what extent, and this is, I guess, kind of a part two to the SVP activation question, that does our partner money, could it be put to work as a sort of political advocacy? I don't know, it's tricky.
Yeah.
But, you know, maybe we marry those two somehow.
Yeah, I think, gosh, Renee, that is, like, it's a great, I think, you know, one, Terry's right. We are looking at doing that and having more of a curated list as we go into January about shared actions. I think you know, there's the world that we want, the world that there is, which is that, you know, we do have donors can still open a lot of doors. SVP as a 501c3 organization cannot give directly to political candidates, but that doesn't mean that all of you as individuals can't, or organizations that we work with, like Progress Alliance, that I know many of you are familiar with. And it's good as you think about, you know, your overall giving. Like, are you funding advocacy, but are you also thinking about, it can also be your neighbor. You don't have to necessarily give financially to have that access to power. It's the perception. One thing I was thinking about, as Stefan, you mentioned some of the people that are most kind of, you know, that have one of the strongest voices around capital gains, were people that said, hey, I'd pay that. And frankly, like, I'm not paying it, and I probably will not in this lifetime, but we as a collective, as SVP, I think, and as an organization that is known as philanthropy and can identify that, like, you yourself might, you know, if we had capital gains 2 come up, whatever it's gonna be next, like, don't think that, like, you don't need, like, your voice just as a partner and as part of SVP is just as powerful, because I think we have that perception, and you know what, we need to use it. We have that power, and we should use it. So, other questions? I'm gonna come to the back.
So the quick answer on the tax policy piece is cities and all jurisdictions that are subdivisions of the state of Washington, they only have the taxing authority that we explicitly grant to them. So they actually have very few tools in their toolbox. Counties and junior taxing districts, ports, school boards, hospital districts, cemetery districts, diking and drainage districts. Did you know how many junior taxing districts we have? They only get to use property tax by and large. Cities have more tools. Sales tax, B&O tax, property tax. But unless we give them explicit authority, they can't be models on the tax code by and large. Obviously, the city of Seattle has used the tools that they have, and they did the Jumpstart tax, which was a payroll tax. And so, yes, they can try some things on, but it does not have the same benefit of being a lab of innovation like the spending side does. And I will turn it over to Sharon to talk on the spending side and how those can be demonstration projects.
Because I can spend it all day. So to your specific question around guaranteed basic income, we do have about 11 pilot projects here in Washington State. Some of them are on the smaller side. There is one pilot project from King County. There's one in Tacoma, and there's a couple of other on the east side of the state. The largest, most effective guaranteed basic income pilot project that has been instituted in the country is Cook County, in Chicago, Cook County, which has been doing some kind of guaranteed basic income for about 20 years. We're hoping to bring them here to show us what it looks like to do a guaranteed basic income. The argument that we hear a lot around the guaranteed basic income is that the money is there's a lot of commas and a lot of zeros that nobody wants to pay for, right? And we're constantly like, right, but if we elevate everyone out of poverty, then we don't have poverty. And that is right, and that's sort of a loop that a lot of present company excluded, obviously, but a lot of our legislators can't get out of, because we do silo how some of this work gets done, right? So for a lot of folks who are just like, well, but we also need to fund Department of Corrections, right? But if people aren't in poverty and they get a good education, and then they can make a really good educated decision about what they want to do post-secondary, and then they can get a really good job, get paid $65,000, $75,000 a year living in Mattawa, they're not going to go to prison. Right? So for a lot of people, they're just like, right, but corrections. Right, but if we don't have people going to corrections, we don't need corrections. Right, so it's really the return on, the argument around the return on investment of putting this much money to end poverty. And I think one of the things about poverty and guaranteed basic income specifically that we're often coming up against is that we still moralize poverty. Yes. We still live in a country in which if you work hard, work 60 hours a week, do the right thing, are very puritanical, go to church, all the stuff, then you don't become poor, right? Everyone talks about the homeless and the housing instability and the people like they've made the decision to live in their car. And the reality is that some of us are one medical expense away from losing their house. So to come back to your question, there are great, the benefit of having some of these pilot projects is that we then have the data to be able to say, of the 10,000, of the 1,000 people that we gave $500 to for the past 2 years, all of them have done something, right? They've either gone to college and used that money to pay for credits, or they've established a small business. The Latino community in Washington State is by far the largest small business owners here, and they generate billions of dollars in taxes. You know, so to be able to give that kind of support, and most of them aren't going to ask for a small business loan because they don't know that they can, or they don't have the documentation to be able to do so. So those kinds of pilot projects, and this is the interesting thing about having a conversation with Senator Frame sometimes, is that as a nonprofit, I can go to philanthropy and say, hey, there's an opportunity here for us to do a pilot project for 2 years. Let's think about it. And had other, you know, nonprofits or philanthropists been able to say, yes, let's pivot, let's figure out, let's innovate. I think the irony about having philanthropy in Washington State is that because we're such a huge tech center that's based on innovation, a lot of the philanthropists that come out of the tech center don't want to do anything innovative. And they all want to do something based on data. I'm like, right. But sometimes, right, I'm just like, right, Mr. Facebook, but also like you do things till you break that, like go forward and break, right? And I'm just like, but we have to innovate, and I think some of the work that we've done together has been, look, this worked in Tacoma, this worked in, you know, King County, this worked, we can make it happen. It's just the argument, and I think the benefit of philanthropy is that we can be innovative, if allowed to be, to then bring it to the state and say, we've done a pilot, a public-private pilot. Try to say that 3 times. And now we want to work with the state to build this into the budget.
Can I ask a follow-up question on something you just said? Oh, sorry.
Yes, but only if you
Well,
wait
this
for the mic.
really makes things slow. So part of your argument, which made total sense to me, was you know, if you invest in early childhood education or with basic income or all of those great arguments, then, you know, down the road you experience the benefit. But then somebody who's I don't know what the right name is, the person who might be the commissioner of prisons or something, you know, saying, but I still have this bill to pay. So it's like a short versus long-term dynamic. So how do you, because I'm increasingly feeling like so many of these conversations are about what's your communication strategy. So what do you say in those? Give you the words.
It's not pie. It isn't a table full of food that is finite.
But short term versus long term though.
And this is, yes, so
Yes,
it's a narrative question, right? Like, but also it is for me as an organization, and for me as the leader of that organization, for me it is a values statement of what you're saying to me, if you're saying as a chief, as a commissioner of the, if you're the
Department of Corrections.
Department of Corrections and you have to pay the light bill, and who's gonna pay the light bill if it's not for the prisoners that are there and you're getting some money from the prisoners? What you're saying is that the light bill is more important than the life of the prisoner, and the life of the person before they became a prisoner, and the life of the society before they went into incarceration. And the value there is that some people have forgotten that we are a small village.
So is it the if not now, when kind of point?
No, it's more of a if. So a couple of things. One, some people are always going to want to perpetuate white supremacy. And the system of incarceration is white supremacy. The system of poverty is white supremacy. The system of diseducation is white supremacy, right? So there are gonna be some people that are always gonna say, well, I need a job, I need this, I need to pay the rent over at Monroe. The reality is that what they're doing is trying to keep their job. And it's not about the rent. What they're doing is that they've seen the numbers, and for them, people equals dollars. So we have forgotten that we are in a relational society. So what we were talking about earlier, which is the targeted universalism of if it works for you, then it works for me too. They're not a part of that targeted universalism because
Curb cut story.
right, they're part of a capitalist system, right? And you can't. I don't want to say the word
Well,
socialist.
both things
because
can
that's
be
gonna-
true.
Both things can be true. And our society has to judge itself on how it treats its people in prison, right? And we treat our people in prison like garbage. And the reality is that I'm actually not mad if we end the prison system in the United States, specifically in Washington State, by giving people the chance from the very beginning, pre-birth. You know, and people, they say this in education all the time, which is if we create a good educational system in Rainier Valley, what are you taking from me in Madrona? And what I say is absolutely nothing.
You benefit.
Right. Because I shouldn't have to have an argument as to whether your robotics club for your third grader is gonna go away if I just want a good roof over the head of Aki Karosi, because it's not pie. The thing that we often get into the argument about is we have a finite dollar amount, and we don't, right? Because if we actually taxed the wealthy, we'd have so much more money to do the things that we need to do to elevate our people out of poverty. Do you have children?
Yes.
Okay.
And yet there are budgets.
Right, and yes, and the number is, you know, you're always gonna have a dot, like, at the end of the day, you're just like, okay, I'm negative 100, or I'm positive 300, or I'm like in the red here. But at the end of the day, you treat your children how they need to be treated, and you make sure that they're all given what they need to survive, thrive, and
For sure.
and ensure. We don't do that as a state.
I'll just jump in really quickly just to say, I think we often, so as much as it frustrates me that not everybody just loves to talk about tax policies, isolated tax policy, you know, we have sold tax policy over the course of years by tying it to specific investments. And that's important, and I wish we were honest with ourselves about what it actually costs, right? So like, we just passed the capital gains tax, we tied it to early learning, and we got another $500 million a year into early learning and education, which is great, and it's a fraction of what we need to do, right? And so it's, you know, the thing that I feel like I need help with is like, you know, the visionary, like, poverty is a policy choice. Period, end stop. There is so much wealth in this state. We could choose to end poverty. We could choose to house everybody. Like, you know, we are, like, from a tax standpoint, kind of middle of the pack in the country. We've got up a little bit in the last couple of years, but like, people are like, oh, our budget's growing so much, it's grown so, and I'm like, yeah, wealth has grown a lot in this state. A lot. In the last 10 years, the budget has gone up to reflect the demands of our communities, and yet, My childcare bill is $2,100 a year. And if I have an infant, it would be $2,800. Sorry, a month. Pardon me. Clarification.
That is some very affordable
$2,100 a month for preschool, $2,800 a month for infant care. I'm a small business owner, and literally yesterday, I started talking to my business partners about like just updating our HR policy to be flexible with our employees if they have a baby, because they're not going to be able to afford nor be able to find infant childcare if they were to have a baby. And so maybe we need to update our HR manual to talk about flexibility, right? We can solve that problem, but we choose not to. And I think that that's the tough part. It's not like we don't know. I love the point about data. We've got all the data in the world to tell us early learning is the right investment. But stacking up, even though it would be like a 20-year, it would probably, if you made that commitment for 20 years, you'd see the drop off. But getting my colleagues to commit to a stacked 20-year investment, folks are not that visionary. I could use all the help in the world from folks who have vision. And my God, if any state has vision, it's this one. Look what we have created here. I wish we just created for the people who need it the most. Okay, I'm off my soapbox back to you.
We're gonna do Carrie and then Omar. Let's see, Carrie.
Okay. So since obviously I'm really focused on the upcoming session, it's work for me, I'd love to ask Senator Frame, not to put you on the spot, but with your colleagues, there's so many proposals out there. The wealth tax, the baby bonds, the GDI, the expanded tax credit, et cetera, et cetera. Which are the ones that generate the most allergic reaction with your colleagues, and which are the ones that you feel there's more, because I agree with Renee, so much of this is narrative, and what they hear from constituents and what they can sell. And so I'm just curious what you hear in the halls, and is there a difference between the different avenues that are being attacked that are responded to differently?
Interesting.
It's a great question. I will tell you what people don't have an allergic reaction to is the working families tax credit. And everybody loves the working families tax credit. It's just, and I think the only hesitation people have right now is like, we literally just passed it, please give it a chance to be implemented, which is fair. And so I think when the time comes, expanding the age will actually not be a hard sell. I think things like baby bonds or the Washington Future Fund is its official title, guaranteed basic income, they are visionary, so people struggle with it, and it always comes back to like, fun, how are you gonna pay for it, right? And that's where my tax policy comes in. The estate tax reform, the proposal that's actually been put on the table, it's not really, people aren't really allergic to that. It's actually making it more progressive, and it's helping smaller states, and it's having the bigger states pay a little bit more. Frankly, my biggest problem with tax policy is that people don't slow down to understand it. I have very few colleagues that understand tax policy. Not just in Washington State, y'all. Like, I go to NCS, National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm on the state and local taxation work group. I go to the budget, kind of the group budget tax thing. I'll do that next week. And like, I sit in a room with budget leaders from across the country, and very few people understand tax policy. So the allergic reaction that the allergic reaction is, how are you gonna pay for it? With these big visionary things that people think are like extras, but are this really systemic, Renee, to your point, are the real systemic things that can actually tackle the root problem? But people like accept that I have to pay for this thing, to Sharon's point. Right. And so my colleagues struggle to have vision in this way. That's one. But two, they struggle to understand tax policy. And I don't mean to like, this is not like a judgment. Like it's technical and it's hard and people get very intimidated. And it took us 10 years for me to like get my colleagues to be able to throw a punch on taxes, because the other side's message is so simple. And it is.
No,
Indeed, yes. And so to like explain complex tax policy to people, which is what I have to say though, over the course of 10 years, really helping people understand the upside down and regressive tax code, that has broken through. Look at the headlines. The press understands it, people understand it, I have people say it back to me in like regular conversation. And so I think what, one of the things that we can do is people who are perceived to be smart, wealthy, know a thing or two about money, coming to say, hey, Senator, I'd like to have a meeting with you. And I want to talk to you about why I support the wealth tax and why I think it's good tax policy and see what questions you have as your constituent. My biggest frustration last year was people were like, I just think that idea is just it's not that cooked. And there's questions. And I was like, cool, what are the questions? Yeah. These are people I've worked with for a dozen years. There's questions. And I'm like, what are they? And they quite literally, I was like, you can't even formulate the question because you have not slowed down to understand the policy. The strongest force in Olympia is inertia and like the lack of understanding. And so I think that's one of the things, the flip side of the like, how are you pay for it, allergic reaction is, actually, let me talk to you about how our tax code barely taps into taxing wealth. And here are some of the tools in the toolbox that we can do to do that.
Great, I think we've got Omar, and then I'm gonna go back to Ruby. We're gonna make our way around.
Thank you. Senator Frame, I've been listening to you speak about tax for many years. I love it, and I'm in financial. I do tax a little bit. I believe in wealth tax, estate tax, really critical. Two-part question here. So what do you, how do we deal with tax avoidance? You pass policies like that in Washington State.
Yep.
We pick up and move to, Oregon or Florida or Texas.
So what we tend to tie the spend to has everything to do with the coalition that comes together to fight for it. Capital gains, when early learning advocates started showing up and saying, we're gonna fight for this, we'd like it to be funding early learning, suddenly we had a bill that passed. And so, that's one example. I think what I can see right now that's brewing is the housing advocacy community is starting to really understand the scale of the problem we're trying to solve and understanding that nobody is talking honestly about the cost to tackle it. And starting to see that the wealth tax proposal is perhaps something that could actually meet the scale and meet the moment right now, as a couple of examples. Those are two, early learning and putting a roof over everybody's head are policies that nobody disagrees on, actually. Like we've got the policy to back it, people agree with it, it's just like how much money do you want to spend? On tax avoidance, what's sort of interesting, and I saw the link about Florida, so I'm gonna just take my moment. I already said this in Geek Wire for those of you who read that, but I'm gonna say it in this room. The data does not support that people just up and leave because of tax policy.
Yeah.
It does not support that. There's some great research done in the Northeast about migration of the wealthy. And it turns out the migration was all lower and middle income families, that the wealthy were staying put in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, as they moved to increase their taxes. Wealthy people were staying put. It was the lower income people that had to move. Mr. Bezos's announcement is, if you read it, I joked, I was like, it kind of reminds me that he's a human being. Jeff Bezos made the decision like everybody else makes decisions. The research supports it. He wants to be near his aging parents. He's returning to his roots where he grew up. And as a business person, he's moving near major public infrastructure that supports his business. Because he shifted his focus from Amazon, which is here, to Blue Origin, and he wants to be near Cape Canaveral.
How about more sunshine?
Yeah, right? Exactly. Can't produce that in Washington State. And so I just found it so interesting that the press picked up every press release from conservative think tanks trying to make this about taxes. I'm like, y'all, come on now. He could have thrown the biggest punch at us on his way out the door. He could have moved before the capital gains tax went into effect. He didn't do any of those things. He's just like, I'm done being the head of Amazon, and I want to go back to Florida where I grew up, and my parents are there, and my fiance's there, and like, oh, also, I can go play with rockets at Cape Canaveral. And it turns out like that is what the data tells us. So that's my first point, is like, people don't actually move up and move and just to avoid taxes. Now, there are sociopaths, i.e. Elon Musk, who put up polls on Twitter asking him where he should move to avoid taxes. And like, you're always going to have that guy. There's always going to be an anecdote, but by and large, the data doesn't support it. Do people change their behavior? Is there tax avoidance behavior? Sure. There's no question that people will make different financial decisions based on tax policy. Fine. Our revenue estimates that put our revenue at $3 billion a year under my current proposal, like already account for that, already discount. So everybody's like, is your policy going to go in? Like, no. Especially the capital gains, it was so funny about, well, is capital gains revenue going? I don't know, man. Like, it depends on what he wanted to sell and if he was going to sell any next year. I don't know. But by and large, like, we've accounted for the tax avoidance behavior. I don't think people are going to move. And, you know, I'll just say Washington State's tax code, like, our whole system here is, you know, we educate, we inform, and then we enforce. And we have a lot of mechanisms built into the bill for auditing and really holding people accountable, and relying on current systems of taxation to do that. And then, like, the cherry on top is I'm trying to work with other states and see if, like, one of us can do it and provide the model. We adopt policies from other states all the time. You know, we pick up wholesale bills from other states and implement them in our own and tailor them. And again, I think we could be the state to do this and then watch the chips fall, particularly if this is a Supreme Court case. This Moore case is ruled in the favor of the Moore family. A lot of states that rely on income tax that piggyback on the federal tax code are suddenly going to be looking for replacement revenue, and this is going to be a very interesting proposal for them. Because, by the way, the states absolutely have the ability to tax the ownership of assets, even if they claim the federal government doesn't. And with that,
I agree with everything you've said. The study that is mentioned, I read it from cover to cover because I've been in meetings where people say people will leave the state. There's a well-researched study that says they will not leave the state. But I think the media is really eager to seize on the one person who might leave the state and promote that as though it's mass movement of people out of the state. It's not true. At the risk of this becoming the Senator Frame show, I'm going to insert one idea that I think is really important that hasn't been mentioned yet, and it's part of our legislative agenda. We have 7,000 members across the state of Washington who help us to set our legislative agenda every year. And I know because my former school board service and because I am an education researcher by trade, that many people in many communities in Washington state say the biggest problem that they're facing right now is youth mental and behavioral health. You probably know someone, or you know someone that knows someone who has a kid that is struggling with this issue. The percentage of kids in Washington state that are reporting serious anxiety or depression is off the charts and one of the highest of any state in the nation. And the numbers are even higher for different communities. So children of color, particularly multiracial children, and children that identify their sexuality. It is something that our members have come to us and said, please do something about that. And because I went to graduate school with a number of people who are now superintendents of schools, I reach out to them and I ask them, what are you seeing in your schools and communities? And when I hear from every single person that I know that is in that role that says that the number one issue, even more important than funding of public education, is addressing this problem, I know that it is significant. And so my hope is that in the next legislative session, recognizing fully that it's a short session and that it will be done before we can blink our eyes, that we're starting to address that issue. Because as the executive director of Children's Alliance, I think about all 1.6 million children in Washington State, and the number of children that are doing harm to themselves or doing harm to others is scary. And we don't have systems in place to address that issue. We have a very much of a distribution problem in our state where we don't have enough providers, and those providers are distributed in the state in ways that they're not getting to the kids that need their help the most. And one more thing that's a complexity of this is that many of the providers in Washington State, as you might imagine, are middle class and white. We are in our public schools, we are now a majority state as far as enrollment of students. And so we have a mismatch that is going to have profound implications over the years if we don't get a handle on it. And so I just wanted to insert that because I think that is a key element that sometimes is overlooked.
William, did you want to respond to that? Because I know there's a lot happening in the Latino community.
Yeah, I think just with this, I mean, to the point also of, you know, the spend, that piece of there are so many coalitions that have these ideas. When we think about there's so much brilliance in community and these asks and what people are seeing, the ideas are there. And the reason why, to point again, the reason why Washington Community Alliance brings together community groups in this way and starts saying, I mean, we would have Latino groups together talking about leadership, and it always ends at the advocacy piece. Because we're talking about this constant need for service, and yet the advocacy piece is, what are we actually gonna change? And so I think that has, you know, to this piece is that there are all these ideas at the table, and people are doing this advocacy to try to get these things done, but the next piece is, where is that money? Where is that funding? Where is that investment? And even to the piece, I mean, our money is our values, right? We definitely, what we invest in as a state is what comes to fruition. And so if we are constantly investing in policing, if we are constantly investing in downstream these services, that is the narrative. I definitely think, you know, that has been something in a lot of our partnerships with community groups that we've talked about, this narrative, because, right, it takes one piece to say that this one person, that's the narrative, that money, you know, somebody's leaving the state. But the narrative, we have this thing where when we bring community together and say, what does safety look like? You can ask a group of people, what does safety look like? And I can tell you that nobody ever says police. They say a healthy family, they say, you know, I get to go to the park, they say fun, they say that I can breathe, all these things that they say, and they don't say this system of policing. And so it's in our schools, I mean, this investment, so what we invest in comes to fruition. And so this idea that, well, we're gonna give up one for the other is, what are we actually investing in? And if we never make that move, if we never take that step, we will be stuck in the same cycle. And so, I mean, and we are very much the mental health piece, or our young people. And when we think about poverty, biggest group are children. Our children are in poverty. And so also this narrative that homelessness is this thing, it is children that are in poverty. And so when we think about having, you know, basic incomes, when we think about baby bonds, we're actually tackling who it is that's in poverty, which is children. And that's not the narrative that some media is going to show, but it is children across the state that are in poverty. And so what are we doing, and how are we signaling, I mean, you know, how are we signaling that care for our children in this state? And it is through investment, it is through this change in policies.
We've got Tali and then George.
Hi, thanks for being here, I really appreciate it. I want to ask Lillian, can you just follow up when you say policy in terms of specifics of what your organization is advocating for? And I'm really curious, like we spend a lot of time talking about the wealth tax, which would generate more revenue, but when we talk about lifting people out of poverty, so there's an earned working families tax credit that's literally putting money back in their pockets. And what the mental model I've started thinking about is, philanthropically, we often give to our local food banks. But what if people had more money in their pocket to be able to buy the food, right? That's the systemic solution versus the Band-Aid solution. So I'm just curious, what, besides the earned working families tax credit, which sounds like it's popular and it's passed, how can we show up as people who want to support poverty alleviation and changing a broken system as part of SVP, as individuals who just pay attention and can sign on to a bill or show up and or call our legislators, even if they're in the right camp, right? They always need a little extra pressure. So what are some practical, and I'd love to also hear because I think Children's Alliance has a pretty deep policy portfolio. What are some specifics around poverty alleviation? What I'd say for us has been to sign on and to really do a lot more education and showing up for expanding working families tax credit, baby bonds. And so those are some that we are looking at for 2024. And no, so that has been for us. And I think it's also been, how do we move past the one-time fixes, and so the wealth tax, looking at that really and having that deeper understanding. I would also really, again, Kamal, sorry about this, but pointing to some of the policy platform that we are signing on with the Washington Community Alliance to do that advocacy. Because even things like we're looking at the expanding the unemployment benefits for workers who have been left out, and that's the other piece around the implementation, right? Not just implementing these, not just saying that the wealth tax passes, but really how are we making sure that the families that have the least access and that have historically been left out, that are low-income workers, that are undocumented communities, that because of all these systems of how do you actually access, the implementation has been something that we really look at too. And so I think having that education along the way and being able to also learn about what would this implementation look like at the local level so that people can actually access when these services are there.
Children's Alliance has our progressive revenue and economic justice portfolio is guaranteed basic income, full support, working families tax credit. We're monitoring the implementation of it. Baby bonds is interesting for us in that, and I'll look to Kamal as well. First person I think that I read an analysis, or first organization that I read an analysis on baby bonds, which is, it has a very large fiscal note. And many people that we've talked to, our stakeholders, wonder if that investment makes sense. And for those of you who don't know, baby bonds is a concept where low-income children and families would be eligible, because they are eligible for Apple Health, to have an investment made that will allow them to go to college, to own a home, or to start a business 18, 20 years out. The challenge is short-term versus long-term. And for many people, there are so many needs that are in communities that it is hard to make the justification for a long-term decision when there's so many short-term needs. So we're monitoring that one closely. We want to have input. The stakeholders that we've talked to are split on the issue. Many progressive people are like, yes, absolutely. And some progressive people are like, well, let's think a little bit about what the implications of this are. So we're monitoring that. Capital gains tax, because the Supreme Court has spoken, and I celebrated heartily when the Supreme Court validated capital gains, but we're starting to hear that there are those that are in opposition that are funding an initiative to try to roll And so we took a strong position, wrote op-eds, filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court. I sat in the Supreme Court and listened to oral arguments on that, which as a policy geek was like my nirvana. I was that day. So we're going to watch that one really closely. And then obviously the wealth tax we're in favor of. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, we've got time for one more question, and Jordan, I saw your hand.
Thank you all so much. I'm so excited about everything that's happening on the state level. And as a resident of Seattle, after the election on Tuesday, I know we're still waiting for final results, but not feeling excited about possibilities for progressive revenue. And we know it's so badly needed at the city level as well. And so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, sort of how you're reading what we're looking for, what we're looking towards here in the city, and if there's any signs of hope or optimism.
Just be candid. I mean, I could.
I expect no progress on progressive revenue at the city level. Bring your energy to the state. And I mean that because I appreciate the question about cities being the lab of innovation for the state. Well, states are the labs of innovation for the federal government. And you certainly can't do a wealth tax at a county or city level. We should absolutely be doing it at a state level. So that's my first plug. You know, I'm deeply concerned. I'm concerned about a lot of stuff right now. And I would just say thank you, Stefan, for mentioning the efforts to roll back all of our progress. And to your question earlier, Renee, about political action, my lord, if that happens, please fund all the work that we're gonna have to do to hold on to our gains. I'm so worried right now about sort of the backlash, and Stefan knows I work a lot of juvenile justice, and I've done just, that's my entire 8 years in the legislature, I've worked on treating children as children and giving them the supports that they need to learn from their mistakes and heal and come back into community as whole people that are able to thrive. And the narrative I'm watching right now about youth violence, and I'm afraid we're gonna go back to the tough on crime, super predator era, where we start passing laws. So just please pay attention to that work if people try to undo our progress, because we know the war on drugs didn't work. We knew that incarcerating children and treating them as adults did not work. We have all the data to prove it. We need to hold on to these gains. You know, I'm going to be watching my new colleagues at City Council very closely. I hope that we will counter narratives around sweeps and reminding them it is a massive waste of public resources to upend people, move them, and have them pop up in another part of the neighborhood just to make one neighborhood happy. It's nonsense. We all need to be working systemically together to build the housing, to build the services, and solve the housing crisis together and not waste time and energy on that. So we'll see, but I think for those of us who care about these issues, I think we're gonna need to redouble and refocus our efforts at the state level to remind people about public policy that works.
Can I ask one question?
We've got time for one real quick question.
Okay.
Can we miss my announcement, asking everyone to use the mic?
Hi, my name is Karen Kalish, and I'm new to Seattle, so I'm wondering if any of you know about the poverty simulation. About 50 people participating in a 4-hour exercise and coming out of really having a new understanding of what it's like to be poor.
Oh, like to live on X amount of dollars.
And if so, would it help to educate a few really important people who we get them to do it and help them be our ambassadors?
As someone who has lived in her car, as someone who has lived on street corners, there's no 4-hour process that you can go through, or like, there's no, you only have $30 to buy food for 4 people this week, because that will ever let you understand what it's like to get into your car and hope that you make it till the next morning. you know what I'm saying? Like, there's no simulation that will ever give you the lived experience of being unhoused or living with 17 people in a 2-bedroom house because that's how you can afford it. Or going to your grandmother's house on 24th and Jackson and hearing her be told that she has to sell her house because industry wants to buy that property to put some crappy Whole Foods up or Amazon take and buy kind of. While I appreciate the desire to have someone have the lived experience even for a moment, you have the light at the end of that tunnel is not the oncoming train that is the constant fear of being unhoused. It's sort of like saying that you can understand the immigrant trauma by watching Univision for a couple of hours. You can't. You cannot know some things until you know them.
I totally understand what you're saying. I participated in one and it turned a whole lot of philanthropists around to get an insight.
Yeah. No. And I think it could turn. I've had philanthropists come to my office and like a day in the life of an ED, and then they're just like, oh my God, I'm never gonna ask you for another report. Because I'm just like, oh, and it's also 7, right, and I'm also, right, and it's like, it's also 7 p.m. and I still have to do a report, and I have to go do this, and and also somebody just quit. Like, I think to grasp it is a possibility. To understand it, there's just no way, right? Like, I've never given birth. And the experience of someone giving birth, I can sort of be like,
Emiko's having a fit.
sorry.
No, I think people wanted to, no, go ahead. Oh.
No, girl. And somebody has to cut me off. Somebody always has to cut me off. That's somebody's job is to. That's good.
Yeah, I'll just say as we close out that, and I appreciate the reflection really about the role that we can play in. And one of the things I would just say is the unique role that you have is like, you know, it's like, because it's Spider-Man, Batman, was like with great privilege comes great responsibility. Batman? Spider-Man? Thank you, I'm embarrassing myself. You know, I hope that you all play a role in facilitating the conversation about who gets to live in Washington State. This is an amazing place to live. It's an amazing place to live, and we want to have communities that have diversity of lived experience, economic experience, specialty, what people are focused on, what they're passionate about, and increasingly, only a very small segment of people can get the privilege of living in our state. And so I think you all are uniquely positioned to tell the story about, we're lucky we get to live here, and we want other people to get to live in this community that we live in. And our experience of living here is enriched when a more diverse set of people can afford to live here and thrive, not just survive, but thrive. To that end, I think what was talked about earlier with like, yes, focus on basic needs, but you all are uniquely positioned to say these big ideas, they matter. And to help us push for, we've talked about education, housing, childcare. We didn't talk about healthcare today. Talk about another major expense that puts people one major incident away from losing everything. Helping us keep the focus on meeting basic needs in a visionary, systemic way, while also these other things that are happening. Like, that's a great role for philanthropy. But again, I think philanthropy also has a role to say, the systems that allowed me to have this much wealth need to be broken down and reformed, and step into the fray to say, it is philanthropy today, but it's systemic change in the future, and the future and the tomorrow starts right now. I I would welcome and appreciate the partnership on that. Because the world I live in is very incremental, it's very electoral terms of 2 and 4 years. And the more visionary people that we have stepping into the fray to say, systemic future work matters, we need to do it now to get there, would be greatly appreciated.
And I guess we'll just add, is that I think in some ways that and a lot of this kind of also comes out to, this isn't an opt-out, right? Like, how are we building bold legislation that is about buying in to our state rather than opting out? And I think, you know, this narrative, and to the council question, yeah, it's been a week. We do a lot of advocacy work and it's been a week. And, you know, we work with small business owners and this narrative that if workers are paid more, business will fail. And without really dissecting what does business mean, because our small business owners get approached, our Latino small business owners, as if improving the life of workers is going to harm them, when they aren't winning in a system right now where a small business could be thriving. And I think this idea of, experiencing, we cannot understand each other's lived experiences, but if we are really going to step into this, it is that we are tied together, that we are building this not because we feel that not because we feel sorry for someone, but because we are wanting to build the best state, the best community possible. And there is research and there are narratives that are going to tell you that an opt-out is not going to work, right? People are going to leave and decimate a community. But if we buy in, everybody does win. I mean, it is incredible that the narrative we see when people have money in their pockets, the businesses, a lot of our Latinx youth, they're starting businesses. That's what they want to do. And if they have that money to be able to do that, they're buying homes as soon as they're able to. They are buying into our community. They are not opting out, not saying, I have enough that I'm gonna go and have my own police for just my block, or my own thing for just they are buying in. And so I think also shifting the narrative of not about just, I wanna know about you, but we are tied together. If you succeed, I'm gonna have a really great life too, great, right? And so I think that idea is also, how are we countering that? And that's a piece I see with the council on where we can go to have this bold legislation to say we are buying in. This is not about siphoning people off.
Yeah, just really quick, I recognize that time is short. I started my nonprofit career not very far from here, about 5 blocks away, at a Boys and Girls Club. I was the executive director there, and because I live in this community as well, I was really driven to try to make a difference for the kids that live in this community. Almost none of the kids that lived in this community then, or their families, live here now, right? And I think about that a lot. And I think about the direct service that we were providing at that time. And direct service is critically important. Please don't hear me say anything negative about it. But we're here because I think in many cases we're all about systems change. And what we're talking about with policy is systems change. And going to the argument about, or the analogy that was made about kids going down the river and drowning, and what do you do to go upstream to address the systemic issues that are having them fall in the water and drown. I think in different ways we're all working on that, and that is critically important. And those of us in my organization, we believe that there's a small number of the people that we talk to that think about systems change. But systems change is how society is going to change. It's not going to change by direct service, because you can solve a problem and then that person is back the next day. And so I encourage you to continue to think about your own analysis and where you can add value in that systems change argument. And forgive me for my voice again.
Thank you. Thank you all. And actually, look, Karen, thank you for that question, because I think it set up a really nice way to close. Leanne, one of the things I think about has opted, I think most of you know, I grew up in Seattle, and I don't know anybody who moved, like, nor my family, and not just beyond the economic reasons hold constant. Nobody's families moved to Florida or Arizona. And it's because this is like, and they're desperately working to stay here, to opt in, like, this is one of the nicest places, I think, like, in the world. I left and I came back. My sister left and came back. Most people I went to high school with, I went to high school about 10 minutes away, they came back. Like, and when I think about it, really, it is like we are, people want to be here and they want to opt in. And I think tying back to the last session, I mentioned the curb cut effect. So like really, the policies that you all are working on, the leadership is like, if we design tax policy and systems change for our children, for those farthest away from opportunity, we are all winning. And I love that way of thinking. It's not an opt-out, it's an opt-in. I think all of you mentioned, like, our role is to really to educate, to socialize, and to advocate. And so I have to make a plug for Terry, who's going to stand up November 27th.
Yeah, and it's a Zoom.
It's a Zoom virtual where we're actually going to talk about both like how you advocate, but what we're specifically going to do. And then we'll come back again in January. But Renee brought up like this series was not an accident that we kind of geared everybody up to really take action. So I invite you all to do that. There's also a one-pager and some additional materials just around some bills that might be coming up, some more information for balance our tax code, and just a huge thank you again to all of your leadership.